In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary context for Romanticism in preparation for a discussion of William Wordsworth, John Keats, and Walt Whitman. Romanticism was an attempt to break away from classical conventions and to cultivate native traditions that met the social and political attitudes of the time, to be something modern and new. As with the Enlightenment, the dates with which we frame this intellectual and aesthetic movement can differ depending on what we're emphasizing. For instance, if we're focusing on literary works, we might say that Romanticism begins with William Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798. But if we were to focus on politics, we might say it begins with the American Revolution in 1776, or the storming of the Bastille in France in 1789. To keep things simple, we'll just say that the Romantic period for us runs from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century. As we get into our discussions of Fyodor Dostoevsky, we'll also see that Romanticism starts to impact the literature of Eastern Europe and Far East countries in the latter half of the 19th century, as imperialism, war, trade, and technology results in the globalization of cultures. But none of these dates are hard and fast dates. We see romantic characteristics in literature to this day, and some argue that Romanticism as a period still hasn't ended. So when we think of the Romantics, we think of rebels. The Romantic period was a time of revolution all over the world. If you turn to pages 378 to 79 in your anthology, you'll see a map of the many crucibles of revolution during the early 19th century that were located all over Europe. And many Romantic poets were involved in these revolutions, including those like William Wordsworth, although Wordsworth, like many others, would be turned off by the bloodiness of the French Revolution and become more conservative later in life. When people talk about Romanticism, then, they typically talk about it as a reaction against what came before. Thus, we call them rebels, and you'll see varying degrees of this rebellion in each Romantic poet's art. I'd mentioned earlier that some people would argue that we still live in a Romantic age, and it is in large part due to these aesthetic stresses on making things new, rebelling, and being an individual, that those who say we're still Romantic today can make their arguments. Originally, though, Romanticism is a reaction against the Enlightenment. Now, to make it absolutely clear what this means, we'll do a quick review. In our lecture on Pope and Voltaire, we gestured towards the importance of classicism, or the revival of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, art, and literature during the Renaissance. When we think of classicism, we generally think of art that stresses an understanding of nature as ideal, unified, harmonic, symmetrical, and so forth, very clean and balanced. These conceptions of nature come from the classics themselves, like Aristotle's Poetics, which explains that the poet is simply an imitator of nature, that nature exists separately and outside of the poet's mind as a persisting and essential reality, a greater reality than anything the poet could imagine or feel on his own. Thus, nature is key to our understanding of the world, and the poet's job is to convey nature in a way that both catches the audience's attention and helps us to understand nature. You might remember that Pope, as an ancient, looked to the ideals of the classics and thus shaped his art through this very same Horatian principle to produce art that delights as well as instructs. In our lecture on Pope and Voltaire, we also mentioned the importance of the scientific revolution. For discussions of Romanticism, the thing to remember is how the scientific revolution begins to stress reason over faith. By the Enlightenment, then, the aesthetic movement that is prominent is neoclassicism, and neoclassicism brings together the ideals of classicism with the reason of the scientific revolution. Pope was a neoclassic, although Voltaire was not. And neoclassics believed in such concepts as Concordia discourse, which suggests that all harmony exists for a reason in order to support the overall harmony of the cosmos. Note the combination of reason with ideals here. Likewise, the great chain of being is another example of how neoclassics rationalized the natural order. And just like the classics, the neoclassics believed that just as nature is ordered, so should we be. That is, our art should likewise follow a hierarchy. And in the 18th century, there was a strict decorum on how one should conduct his or her own poetic career, and which forms to use to communicate which ideas, and so forth. There was a proper way of doing all things. For instance, the epic was the most popular and difficult form, while lyric poems were at the bottom of the hierarchy. So one should use the epic to stress larger-than-life models of virtue, while using the lyric poem to devolve to unworthy subjects like alcoholism and gratuitous sex. This is why it's important to note the nods towards epic qualities in Pope's Essay on Man, discussed in our lecture on Pope and Voltaire. These epic qualities help Pope to announce the importance of his poem and his moral intent. Meanwhile, Voltaire chose the more vernacular form of prose and included much material that could be considered unheroic, unvirtuous, and thus unethical. Like the classics, neoclassics also believed that uniqueness is just a figment of an ignorant person's imagination, that the individual should only be a focus of study when he or she models the general constants of universal nature. Dr. Samuel Johnson, another one of the most prominent writers of the 18th century, actually once stated that the belief that one is unique is proof of one's ignorance. In the larger picture, we see this same thought play out in the kind of literature being produced at the time. The 18th century is when we see the rise of the biography, but the neoclassics didn't write biographies to celebrate the eccentricities of individuals. Instead, they wrote biographies to point out how these individuals were models of what to do and not to do in the larger picture of life and society. The Romantics, then, stand against everything the neoclassics stand for. They rejected the limitations of neoclassical and classical literature, defied the rationalization of nature, and celebrated the eccentricities of the individual. They felt that reason deadens nature or makes nature dull. The thinking was that science may reveal the mechanical laws of nature, but it could never reveal the soul of it. Facts can't tell us how to capture issues like beauty, goodness, and truth. This is a response against the scientific revolution and its mechanization of the universe accomplished by mathematical laws, but it's also a response against the industrial revolution, which made it seem as though rural, simple life and nature were being forgotten as people from the countryside abandoned villages to move to cities or simply turned the villages into cities. This doesn't mean the Romantics didn't believe in an objective external reality beyond themselves, but it does mean that they valued the subjective or individual experiences of nature. Earlier, we had said that classicism and neoclassicism saw the poet as a mirror of nature, that the poet shouldn't impart any personal feeling or imagination upon his rendition of nature, but instead should strive to capture nature's universal truths. And this is why classical and neoclassical art appears so clean, symmetrical, and unified. If neoclassic art and literature can be conceptualized as a mirror of nature, then a romantic art and literature should be conceptualized as a lamp, where the individual poet's consciousness illuminates his or her sense of nature. That is, it is up to the individual to filter and recreate reality, or rather to imagine reality as he or she perceives it. Nature in romantic art then is not clean, symmetrical, and balanced. These would indicate that the poet has elevated nature to an ideal or reduced it to geometric lines and perfection. Instead of being ordered and harmonic, romantic nature is free and organic, spontaneous, and changeable. Instead of being unified and rational, romantic nature is individual, personal, and focused on feeling. In fact, this is an age that validates feeling and subjectivity over reason and objectivity. On the screen, we have two paintings. Based on our discussion of neoclassicism and romanticism, try to distinguish which you think is which. That is, which one would be neoclassical and which one would be romantic. The one on the left, the Oath of Herati, is neoclassic. Note the general symmetry and balance. There are 3 empty spaces under the columns foregrounded by 3 groups of people. The paint strokes are clean, as are all the lines created by the architecture and body poses. Even the subject matter, 3 brothers swearing fealty to their father and nation during a time of war, the men standing strong and rational, as the women slump overcome by emotion. It's all suggestive of these ideal and model behaviors stressed by neoclassicism. All this is opposed to the painting on the right, J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship is a well-known romantic painting. In it we see slaves that have been tossed overboard being preyed upon by the creatures of the sea. It was inspired by an actual event in 1781 when a captain had thrown slaves overboard in an attempt to collect the insurance money he had taken out on their lives. Framing this horrific scene are the vibrant and passionate colors of a sunset and storm. The irony of nature's beauty, in contrast to the scene of mass murder in the sea, makes what we feel as viewers more poignant. Rather than stress ideals like loyalty, strength, unity, and reason, this painting stresses violence, disorder, and emotion. There are a few qualities of romantic literature I want us to focus on. Just as we had the journey trope in our Enlightenment literature, we have a kind of journey trope in Romanticism as well, but instead of necessarily entailing an arduous physical journey over vast or great distances, the romantic journey is an internal one. Many romantic poets strove to be what we call poet prophets. Poet prophets sought to liberate audiences from conformity by delivering them to truth. Note how the poet prophet emphasizes things that are important to the Romantics, breaking out of conformity and illuminating some kind of truer understanding of the world to which institutionalized knowledge cannot give access. Sometimes this kind of poet persona can feel egotistical. We'll really get this sense when we reach Whitman, who evolves the poet prophet persona into the American poet of democracy, the poet who sees him or herself as equal to everyone and speaks for all people. As mentioned earlier, the Romantics emphasized feeling, and these feelings can be mapped on a spectrum, with sensible feelings feelings being on one end and sublime feelings on the other. We've already encountered sensibility with Voltaire and his use of sentimental novel tropes. Remember that sensibility stresses one's sensitivity to beauty and thus feeling immorality. If you see something disturbing like a person dying on the street, you know it's wrong because it offends your sense of the beautiful. To add to this, sensibility is feeling tempered or guided by reason. A truly sensible person should have compassion for others, but within reason. For instance, if you have a sibling who is constantly getting into trouble, stealing money, getting thrown into jail, etc., you love them and you try to help them, but after a while, if they keep persisting and don't change, reason dictates that you've done all you can and you are no longer obligated to help them. This is how a sensible person thinks. They're not overly attached or blinded by their emotions, but they are compassionate. Think of sensibility as that feeling that is coming out of neoclassical ideals and rationality. In literature, sensibility is often announced by the presence of melancholy, which is a kind of thoughtful, introspective, or pensive sadness. You might also see nostalgia and quiet weeping. On the other end of the spectrum is sublimity. Sublimity is feeling that is elevated beyond reason, and it may be seen in some ways as an opposite to sensibility. Sublimity argues against the sensibility belief that beauty gives us access to the truths and ideals of the cosmos, whereas sensibility defines beauty as that which is perfect and symmetrical, just as those in neoclassicism would. Sublimity defines beauty as imperfect. For instance, a peacock has a small head with a disproportionately large body. It's not symmetrical or balanced, yet we often consider it beautiful. Or there's a beauty mark on a woman's face. It's not symmetrical, but it has been seen as a mark of beauty. Beauty is just superficial pleasure. Sublimity then argues that the way we can access the truths of the cosmos is not through beauty, but to transcend reason, to feel nothing but feeling, and liberate ourselves from the strictures of Enlightenment and neoclassic rationality. And we do this by confronting ourselves with that which evokes terror and awe or astonishment, something that makes us aware of our finiteness. For instance, when you stand at the edge of a cliff with a gaping chasm below, you are made aware of how small you truly are. Or when you stand before the ocean, calm and placid, reaching so far into the distance that it curves into the horizon, you are overwhelmed by its vastness. Or when you're standing outside in a raging storm, claps of thunder echoing overhead, you are astonished by the chaos. And this goes the other way too. You might experience the sublime by looking into the microcosmic worlds of cell life. You can experience the sublime when surrounded by total quietness or violent sound, darkness or extreme light, things that are powerful and in a sense make you feel great or small. Remember though, the most important feature is that the sublime emphasizes feeling beyond reason, whereas sensibility emphasizes feeling guided by reason. In the paintings on the screen, John Constable's painting on the left may be seen as sensible. The style still maintains that sense of balance and order from neoclassicism, while starting to incorporate some disorderliness in the common scene of labor in the foreground. Our eye is drawn by the horizon and meandering stream to the church steeple in the back, suggesting an ideal past to which we must return. And overall, the painting suggests nostalgia for a rural simplicity in the face of the time's rapidly industrializing landscapes. The nostalgia and the ordered structure of the scene allow viewers to reflect on the feelings it conveys. So in Constable's painting, we're not immersed in the violence and passion of emotion as we were in Turner's painting, which is a good example of the sublime, but instead directed to feel, guided by reason. Let's talk about some of the Romantic poets we'll encounter then. William Wordsworth is generally seen as one of the most prominent leaders of British Romanticism. He grew up in the Lake District, which is one of England's most beautiful regions, mountainous and lake-filled, located in the remote northwest. However, both of Wordsworth's parents died before he was 14, and he spent much of his 20s wandering about England and France, possibly even serving as a spy for the French during his early years. Although, as mentioned earlier, he was turned off by the bloodiness of the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror, becoming more politically conservative later in life. He visited Tintern Abbey for the first time in 1793 when he was 23 years old, and returned 5 years later in 1798 with his sister. The poem we have, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, reflects upon both his reminiscences and present experiences during his visit in 1798 with his sister. The poem was also part of the Lyrical Ballads collection published in 1798 in collaboration with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whom you might know as the author of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Lyrical Ballads is generally seen as a pivotal work of Romanticism, stressing the importance of spontaneity, feeling, and individuality, and creating poetry of and for the people with the use of simple language and common cultural references and experiences. Whereas Wordsworth and Coleridge can be considered first generation British romantics, John Keats can be considered a second generation British romantic. He grew up looking up to these poetic giants. And whereas Wordsworth had been born the son of a steward for the largest landowner in the Lake District into a fairly good social position, John Keats was born the son of a stable keeper. He's considered a Cockney poet, or a poet of the lower classes. Throughout his life, he was self-conscious of his social status, and as he grew up, he sought to reach the same level of notoriety and respect as those like the well-born Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, two other second-generation romantics who were born into the upper classes. But Keats faced some challenges along the way. He had a hot temper in school, earning him the name Little Keats. He was originally apprenticed to become a surgeon, but eventually dropped out to be an apothecary, which is kind of like a pharmacist. And by the time he wrote our poem Ode to a Nightingale, he realized he had tuberculosis, which is the same disease that had killed his mother, and that he feared would soon kill his brother, who was in the final stages of tuberculosis. Needless to say, he was acutely aware of his limits and mortality. Walt Whitman is a poet at the very tail end of Romanticism in America, moving into modernism. Wordsworth and Keats help to set the stage for us, showing us where Romanticism begins. Whitman helps to show us where Romanticism, in a sense, ends. Whitman was born on Long Island, raised in Brooklyn. He was largely self-educated, which means he read voraciously but erratically. In his youth, he worked as a printer's apprentice, taught in some local schools, attended the theater and opera, and poked about the local museums. He began to build up a sense of self and political identity at an early age. His father was a radical liberal, naming three of his children, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, and his mother was a Quaker, which helped Whitman to cultivate a sense of individualism. As he grew older, he involved himself in political battles over slavery, territorial expansion, the Mexican War, sectionalism, free trade, states' rights, worker strife, and the new market economy. He even lost a job at one point due to his vocal support for forbidding slavery in the new territories. Leaves of Grass, within which Song of Myself was published, was printed at Whitman's own expense. He didn't include his name on the cover, but did include a photo of himself dressed in workman's clothes with an unbuttoned shirt revealing his undershirt underneath, and a hat cocked casually upon his head. All this showcases that individualism and sense of rebellion common to Romantic poets. He ended up printing 6 editions of Leaves of Grass between 1855 and 1881, and sent his first 1855 copy to Emerson, to which Emerson replied, "I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed." Whitman actually used Emerson's comments about Leaves of Grass without permission in order to advertise and publicize his work, since Emerson was already really well known. It was unscrupulous and brazen, but when we think of the Romantics, we tend to think of poets with great egos. For instance, the very idea that one should be a poet prophet, liberating the people from conformity and delivering them to truths that can only be illuminated by the poets themselves, is pretty egotistical. And as we said earlier, Whitman also claimed to be a poet of democracy, speaking for all people and seeing himself as equal to everyone. This sense of democracy is directly tied to his status as a transcendentalist. Transcendentalism is an offshoot of Romanticism. The term transcendentalism comes from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who defined transcendental knowledge as that which is concerned not just with the objects themselves, but with our mode of knowing the objects, going beyond the physical and into the metaphysical. It's also supposedly a cheeky title adopted by those who gathered around Emerson, the original transcendentalist, to suggest their elitism. But the Transcendentalists were truly social reformers. Just as the Romantics focused on revolution, the Transcendentalists questioned institutions. They felt that America was not living up to its nation's motto, E pluribus unum, or from many, one, which suggests that America should be a community of equals. And instead, the Transcendentalists felt Americans were becoming too obsessed with material possessions as markers of their status and progress. So, like Romantics, Transcendentalists sought to achieve knowledge of the self through a study of nature. With the Transcendentalists, though, we see the influence of Middle Eastern religions that, like the Eastern religions, emphasize the self as a part of nature. As we can see on the chart on the screen, Transcendentalists defined metaphysical nature as a combination of physical nature and the oversoul being kind of like the immanent soul of God that permeates all. The oversoul consists of our soul and the souls of all other things and creatures. Physical nature likewise consists of all physical things, both those things that are what we'd consider natural and those things that we'd consider artificial or man-made. In either case, our physical body and all other physical things, man-made or natural, comprise physical nature, or in short, we are nature. The self is part and parcel of nature. Transcendentalists use the metaphor of the transparent eyeball to conceptualize this sense of self and means by which we're supposed to understand the cosmos. That is, the transparent eyeball suggests that the way to see and experience the world clearly is to take our immaterial selves out of the situation and merge with whatever it is we're looking at in order to understand it fully. Kind of like putting yourself in others' shoes. Another way to think of it is that you are nature looking at nature. And through this kind of self effaced approach, one can come to understand him or herself better by coming to understand all those things and creatures outside of the self. In this case, it's important to remember that we're not just interconnected, but one with everything, similar to the concept of Tao in Taoism and the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. The transparent eyeball is also useful because it makes use of the formative transcendental symbol of the circle. The circle being a shape that represents not just the eyeball, that in a punny way suggests the personal pronoun I, or the self, but the horizon, globe, and cosmic all of which represent the self-dilation or transcendence of the self as we learn to first identify with the self, then with those immediately around us, then eventually with the entire cosmos. Some last concepts for Transcendentalism. Transcendentalists also emphasize self-reliance, which comes from Romantic individualism. For the Americans, this meant growing one's own food and mending one's own clothes and so forth, getting away from those materialistic goals that only look for economic gain, and instead cultivating a sense of that which is truly valuable to a society and self. Transcendentalists are also called the Party of Hope. They defy the pessimism of Puritanism and the puritanical belief in innate depravity, and instead free themselves of all tradition, history, and guilt. The hero of Transcendentalism is the Adamic hero, or the prelapsarian Adam, who represents a self that is new, self reliant, and self propelling in this new earthly paradise of the West.